Good evening, I'm Jennifer Stevens. I teach second grade at Bethel Manor. And I'm just really grateful for you guys for coming tonight. I see a lot of teachers in the audience. Teachers, the fact that you're here and it's a Thursday evening during probably what is one of the most stressful and challenging times of the school year tells me two really critical things about you. Number one is that you're really vested in your students and in this work that we do. And the other is that educators will do pretty much anything for a free jeans day. All right, so whatever your reason, I'm really glad you're here. So humor me, if you will. Let me share a little bit with you about my journey into mindfulness. About 5 years ago, I was teaching second grade for another district. And my students came from what could be considered a challenging demographic. Most of them lived at or below the poverty level. They lived in neighborhoods where crime and violence were everyday occurrences. They were being raised by single parents, sometimes grandparents, even siblings. And they came from generations who had struggled with poverty and lack of education, addiction, incarceration. In their young lives, they had known too much crime, too much violence, too much instability, and not enough resources to go around. Now, because of my background, I had worked in the counseling field prior to coming to education. My classroom sort of became this dumping ground for students with behavior problems. And in the beginning of my teaching career, that might have meant 1 or 2 students, but 15 years in, it was sometimes 1/3 to 1/2 of my class. Now, those of us who have been working with children for the past decade or longer, we don't need a bunch of data and statistics to tell us that our students' needs have changed drastically. Each year, they are coming to us with their minds full of worry and stress, full of fear and frustration. The diagnoses of anxiety and depression in our children is increasing at an alarming rate. They struggle with emotional regulation and self-control. They have a low tolerance for frustration. They lack coping skills, can be angry and explosive. You know, after 15 years in teaching, I felt very confident in my ability to deliver high-quality instruction. I was well-versed in our state standards, I was fluent in my district's curriculum design and pacing, and I was readily able to adapt my instruction to meet the needs of a wide variety of learners. But none of that mattered. Let that sink in for a minute. None of that mattered. And none of that mattered because, as we know, you have to Maslow before you can bloom. I couldn't access my students' higher level thinking until I could get past the behaviors. Now, I had a degree in counseling, so that should have been right in my wheelhouse. But I couldn't help my students process their thoughts, feelings, and emotions if I couldn't get them out of this reactive state that they just seemed to live in. But I knew that I had to find a way. And I also knew that if I couldn't, it most likely would mean the end of my teaching career, because I just couldn't do it anymore. I had been taxed beyond my reserves, was rapidly losing hope, and on the verge of burning out. I knew that I had to turn to my higher power for guidance and direction. And so that's exactly what I did. I turned to Google. Now, I don't recall the exact search terms that I used. It was probably something like emotional regulation in children, or extreme classroom behaviors, or Starbucks job openings near me. But what I do recall is that my search led me to several sites that were dedicated to implementing mindfulness in the classroom. Now, 5 years ago, typing mindfulness in the classroom would have gotten you maybe a handful of hits. Today, you will find so many more. Because mindfulness as a practice is gaining momentum. Its popularity is increasing and expanding because it addresses a critical need that we have in our schools, and because it works. So what is mindfulness? Mindfulness, in a nutshell, is a meditation practice that begins by paying attention to breathing in order to focus on the here and now. And mindfulness is all about being in the present moment. The ultimate goal is to get students enough distance from their negative thoughts and emotions to enable them to observe them and process them instead of just reacting. And it all begins with breathing. Long, slow, deep breaths in, long, slow, deep breaths out. And as students settle into these breathing patterns, they can begin to shift their focus inward to identify those thoughts and feelings that hover just beneath the surface, those thoughts and feelings that often go unacknowledged until they erupt and manifest themselves in these undesirable behaviors. Behaviors like aggression, crying and yelling, destroying things, fleeing, distractibility, inattention, even just shutting down. Now we know that behaviors are a direct response to thoughts, feelings, and emotions. But what our students lack is the ability to identify the feeling, process the feeling, and respond appropriately. Let's think about that. They lack the ability to identify the feeling, process the feeling, and respond appropriately. So what mindfulness does is encourage our students to recognize how they're feeling, identify why it is they're feeling that way, and then process an appropriate response. It takes them out of fight or flight mode, and it puts them back in control. Now there's this beautiful thing that happens with mindfulness, in that all of this introspection and awareness of thoughts, feelings, and emotions is done without judgment. Without judgment. Think about that. Think about what a gift that is. No matter what the feeling, anger, frustration, jealousy, sadness, disappointment, our students learn to accept their feelings exactly as they are for what they are. You know, mindfulness removes the judgment of rightness or wrongness from feelings. So with mindfulness, students are encouraged to accept whatever they're feeling in the present moment. And in doing so, they not only give themselves permission to feel what they feel, but also to be in charge of how they respond to it. And they need that. We need that. With mindfulness, students learn that it's not the feelings themselves that are right or wrong, it's the way they respond to them that's most important. So when we encourage our students to find that calm place within themselves and identify their feelings, we can then begin to give them the tools that they need to manage those feelings, to process instead of reacting. And that's the key component that makes the difference, that critical piece that's missing from our students' reactive behaviors, that processing piece that enables them to think through their responses instead of just reacting. And it's a game changer. So now that I've explained to you a little bit about what mindfulness is, let me tell you a little bit about what mindfulness is not. Mindfulness is not a set, scripted practice. It's not like word study or writer's workshop. Mindfulness is a collection of practices and tools that we give our students to help them navigate the complex and challenging landscape of their thoughts, feelings, and emotions. It's a way to rewire their brain and our students' responses to stress, frustration, and distraction in a way that impacts every area of their daily lives. Mindfulness is also not a one-size-fits-all process. It's not going to look the same every day for every student in every classroom in every school. Mindfulness should be tailored to meet the individual needs of the students. It should be proactive as well as a direct response to issues and challenges that arise in the classroom. You see, the goal of mindfulness is that students are self-monitoring with mindfulness activities as needed throughout the day, and not just in the classroom, but in their daily lives outside of school. Mindfulness also is not just about emotional regulation and self-control. It helps with focus and attention. It helps students develop compassion towards themselves and others. And it helps reduce stress and anxiety. You know, something unexpected happened to me along this mindfulness journey. While I was anticipating the shifts I would see in my students' focus, attention, and behavior, what I was not expecting was the impact it was going to have on me. You see, in learning and implementing these mindfulness practices, I found that I was becoming a more mindful person. I had more patience. I dealt better with my own stress and anxiety. I became better able to identify my feelings and my responses to them. I got better at practicing self-care and being compassionate toward myself and toward others. I became more focused on the feelings that preceded my students' behavior and less focused on the behaviors themselves. I learned to create and sustain a classroom environment of calm and reflection. And in those ways, mindfulness has been a transformative process for me. So I'd like to extend an invitation to you, an invitation to explore the possibilities that mindfulness has to offer. Because this work we do is so hard, and it's so very important. And we need to take care of ourselves as well as our students. So I hope that you feel inspired to begin the journey from mindful to mindful. And not just because of my testimony, but also because of the testimony of some pretty important people.